Hi, I'm going to talk about my philosophy on teaching. So, to get started, I actually want to start off with a statement. I think it was important for me to be able to summarize what my philosophy is in a few sentences. So, I consider myself a facilitator of learning that co creates knowledge with learners. Learning can be messy, but it's through collaboration of both the teacher and the students as we journey together that we can reach our ultimate goal of learning, which is long term retention and transfer of knowledge. Okay, so I know that sounds like a lot of student affairs rhetoric. So let me explain how I developed that. So I'm going to touch on 5 elements. And really, I know you've watched the other videos I've made and we participated in class discussions. I don't think any of this is going to be a surprise based on what my thinking, how it's evolved through this course of this semester. So these are the 5 elements I'm going to touch on. One is the novice versus the expert. 2 is a learner-centered assessment. 3, different learning styles. 4, the role of student development theory. And finally, talking about prior knowledge. At the end, I'm going to try to pull it together, presenting an example of how I may use this as an instructor in the classroom. So starting off, my first element is novice versus expert. A common mistake I think a lot of instructors make is forgetting the process that it took to get to the point of mastering the material that they are now in turn teaching to students. So it's important to step back and remember that students are not at the same place as the instructor. Students are going to struggle with the material and they're not going to necessarily pick up on it. And as I'm reflecting myself and subjects I may be teaching, I didn't pick up on it right away. So it's important for instructors, important for me to step back before class starts, remind myself students are in a different place than I'm in, and that I need to reflect on the path it took for my own learning, the struggles I had along the way, even though other students may not follow the same path I took. But just be aware there's going to be certain struggles that they'll face, and that I need to be prepared to understand where they're coming from instead of just assuming that they'll pick up on things quickly just because I'm now an expert in that area. And also, going a little bit more with that, is creating some activities that allow students to practice what they're now learning, to actually be able to apply it, to build on knowledge that's not simply knowledge acquisition, but they're actually learning it. And so building and planning the appropriate activities helps students synthesize that. Actually leads into my next element, which is learner-centered assessment. Both the instructor and students need to make adjustments, particularly in the classroom, to accommodate learning. So as an instructor, I can certainly come in with my lesson plan, with my game plan for how I want to approach the class, but I need to be very aware that I may not end the class may not end exactly how I had planned, strictly because I'm working with a group of students that all learn differently, and I need to understand that I may want to cover X, Y, Z in the class, but it may be 3 hours and we simply touch on X. But if students are starting to understand and apprehend what X is, we've made accomplishments. As we discussed in class, it's not useful for the instructor or the students just to start talking faster to cram in every point that might have been in the lesson plan. It's better to cover the points that the students can understand and make adjustments accordingly. So part of that is also helping create the right activities and assignments that properly assess the students' learning, which I briefly mentioned in the previous element. So it's important again to create some activities that help assess students' learning, where they may be, and then as an instructor, if we realize there's common themes here, students are not able to apply the knowledge like I thought, or they're not understanding like I thought, then to go back and readjust and to revisit some of the concepts where the students are struggling. Another issue that can get in the way of learning that can come out through assessment is different disciplines may impact or approach learning in different ways, and so cross-disciplinary learning can be challenging. I think a great example of this being done successfully is this class. Now, granted, it is overarching theme is this an education class, but we are pulling in elements from all different areas within education, student development theory, educational psychology, and other areas to help form and provide information regarding to college teaching. Not to mention the micro teaching in the teaching episodes we're doing. We are literally coming all over the board from physics to food science to higher education when it comes to topics. So it's certainly possible. It's just something we need to be intentional about helping students take the information that we may be learning together and applying that to other disciplines. Learning styles is my third element. And as you may remember from my second oral explanation, I spent a lot of time talking about the role of multitasking and the role of technology. So no surprise, I want to touch on that briefly again. Multitasking is something that is prevalent in today's culture, at least in American culture and American students. And research is showing that it's not beneficial. It may have some really short, limited gains, but long term, there's not long-term learning. There's not that long-term knowledge. That's going on is actually detrimental. What students are learning in the midst of multitasking is not being stored the same way, and students have a hard time tapping into that knowledge later on. So for me, I see myself as teaching graduate level students, which are typically 3-hour long classes once a week. So I need to plan accordingly that I have activities and discussions that keeps the class engaged, but also a variety of activities. However, I want to be very aware that I focus on one area, provide some closure before moving on to the next area to help the students focus on one thing and not necessarily multitask. Technology can certainly be a very beneficial thing, and a lot of students may find it helpful to take notes. Typing rather than writing. So to use technology appropriately, but also help students pull away from the computer screen and the iPad screen when it's not necessary for learning. So maybe sometimes it's intentionally having everyone turn their screens off, having people move around, things that change it up so technology doesn't become a temptation and a distraction from learning, but simply something that enhances and provides another way of learning. Next, I want to go in and talk about student development theory. I talked about this also, I believe, in video 3. But it's whether or not you're coming from a student affairs perspective, student development theory can certainly be beneficial for instructors teaching class. For me, it's important to gauge where students are. So again, I see myself teaching graduate classes, and that's the mindset I have as I'm creating this philosophy. A lot of graduate students may have worked through the different vectors in Chickering, and as a reminder, Chickering sees his process not as a pure linear process, but as a vector. He calls them vectors because people could jump back around. There might be cycles. It was not starting from A and ending at Z. So while a lot of students as undergraduates may have progressed through Chickering's vectors, at least some of them, coming into a graduate environment that's new, different, possibly covering material that's new and different from their previous degree, may cause students actually retreat or cycle back through some of the earlier vectors of Chickering's theory. For example, I was a computer science undergraduate major, worked for 3.5 years, and then went back to graduate school, and I had never taken classes like the classes I take in graduate school. So I found now, in further reflection, I wouldn't necessarily have recognized it then, but I found myself really at the two earliest stages, developing confidence and managing emotions. I was having to participate in discussions and apply different kind of organizational theories, things that just I was not used to from my undergraduate. And so trying to feel confident and really managing my emotions, being frustrated with myself. Am I smart enough? Am I good enough to handle this kind of program? Real basic things that I had addressed as an undergrad coming back up again as I was entering a new area. That's not very, I think it's very common for graduate level students, particularly in my field of student affairs, where there is no natural precursor as an undergraduate degree. People come from all over. So being aware as an instructor of what those are, I've touched on before, but I really feel like Sanford's challenge and support theory really is a good way to approach any kind of development. Challenge a student where they may be and why they may feel that way, but offering the support as they work through challenging these ideas and creating some of their own ideas. Again, going back to Perry and his, moving from dualism to multiplicity to relativism, and then even commitment within relativism, using that challenge and support and helping students go through that phase or those phases. So I think it's a crucial element. No one student is alike, and so using theory to your advantage to help at least get an understanding of maybe some similar themes of where students might be feeling or going through at the moment. Development theory can really be a beneficial tool. Then my fifth element is talking about prior knowledge. I think it's really important to come in and at each class activate prior knowledge. Whether this could be through different activities, but activating prior knowledge to see where students stand, then to see what gaps might be there, to also help students connect to the appropriate information, because sometimes students may tap in to prior knowledge, but might not be appropriate to this situation. One great example was something that we watched earlier in the semester, and that was My Favorite No, or something like that, was the name of the activity where a teacher had her students work through a math equation. She went through them and then found that her favorite no, because they're typically common mistakes that a lot of other students are making, then work through why that mistake was happening and how to correct that. Names weren't on there, so no one felt belittled by being called on, but I believe it's a helpful thing for students. So I think having activities like that where you're tapping into what students know, work through some common mistakes to help people recognize that. One of the things that I failed to mention in an earlier element, but I believe it ties in and flows with a lot of them, was my idea of, or not my idea, but the idea of incorporating the prepare, engage, reflect model. And so it's preparing, reading it before class, or having readings for the class, or some other things for students to think on. Engage in dialogue in the class, and so that really could be tapping into prior knowledge of what students read ahead of time. And then following, and this last element really ties back into learner assessment, but following class efforts over, having students reflect on what they learned, and particularly in my area, what they learned from the class and how it's going to relate to their future career goals. So it's not just simply isolated learning just from that one topic, but how it relates to the bigger picture of where the student wants to go following graduation. So I certainly see that as a core element within my own teaching philosophy. Now that I've talked about these different elements, I want to, paint an example of when I'm in a classroom and how I may apply some of these things, or really all 5 factors. So let's just say I'm teaching a graduate level class in student development theory. First, before the class even begins, I want to remind myself the process I took to get to the point of teaching this class, and how I learned the material and mastered this material, information and knowledge, through the years, and how I've applied it, and knowing that I have a lot of experience applying this knowledge that my students won't necessarily have. So knowing that they'll be in a different place than I will be, and that I need to be understanding as they struggle, and knowing they won't necessarily comprehend this new knowledge right away. So just having that mindset going into the class. Then as I'm teaching and working with the students, to be flexible, to assess the class as it's ongoing, pause if students are getting hung up on a certain concept, and go back and revisit it and maybe apply it to some different area to help the students learn. But again, not to try to, if I have 5 points I wanted to cover for the class, it's okay if I don't end the class covering all 5. What's more important is the students are learning the concepts, and if they learn 2 concepts but are really starting to understand it, then that's completely okay. And again, time back earlier, at the conclusion of class, having the students write a reflection of what they've learned from that particular day of class and how it may apply to their future career goals, as well as what they're still struggling with, because that's an important thing too. to understand where the students are struggling. So in the following class, I can maybe pick back up and revisit some of the issues that the students were struggling, as well as affirm the areas there where students are excelling and learning. I'm also going to incorporate different teaching techniques or activities to appeal to some different learning styles. I'm not going to, one of the articles you read suggested not catering to every single student style, so I'm not advocating for that. But recognizing some people appreciate more group class dialogue, some people appreciate small group interactions, and so just providing some different outlets for that within the course of a class. Again, I have 3 hours, and so I think it's important to keep students engaged, to mix up and do different things, but also be cognizant of not trying to do too much within one activity that students start to multitask. So just being aware of where I am, and then try to draw a conclusion and then move on to the next activity. And so students can help shift some of their thinking. I'll use student development theory as I interact with my students and help use as a lens to understand what situations, what feelings students might be having, and how I can best address them. And just again, remembering that no two students are going to be alike, and that I will need to interact with and treat each student individually based on where they currently stand. And then going back and finally to tapping into some prior knowledge, to start the class with an activity where they can demonstrate what they've learned coming into the week. Is there gaps there or they're not? So in case of this student development theory class, I may have a brief scenario, talk about a fictitious student and a struggle they're currently having, and allow the students first individually to read through the scenario, try to identify maybe some theories that might be applicable to this scenario, and then where the student may stand in a different phase of development with these particular theories. And then after individually students have thought about that, allow them to pair up or even in small groups and discuss that and see what they can learn from each other. And then as a class, we can just talk about it. So one, it taps into their prior knowledge, and if students are feeling confident in their abilities or seems like they really know that, I can add some more information to the scenario to allow them to critically think even more. It may lead into whatever the topic that will be discussed for that day, whether it be a new theory or adding on to some other theories, or even mixing them together. So it really could play into the day's lesson. So that's the way of combining all 5 elements into my teaching philosophy. I certainly have learned a lot this semester, and that certainly is, I believe, reflected in my philosophy of teaching. So I'm certainly excited to be able to get into the classroom as I plan on helping co-teach a course in the fall. So thanks for this opportunity to share my philosophy on teaching.